No. All right. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, my embrace family, and welcome to our final discussion on this particular chapter of the book that we have been going over for the past few months, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. So tonight, we're going to be discussing the last part of the final chapter, and it's been definitely quite a journey together going over this book, learning more about the issue of mass incarceration and the issue of systemic racism in the criminal justice system. And tonight, our own sister Rashida Ford will be leading us in a discussion on the final chapter. And then the plan is next week, we'll have one final discussion of the book overall and try to come up with some tentative and practical action items of what we can do to address some of these issues that we have learned about over the past few months. So to start, I'll go ahead and hand the floor to Sister Rashida. As our usual practice has been, we'll start with her giving us a 20-minute summary of the chapter or so, 20 minutes or so. And from there, we will stop the live stream and then open the floor for the discussion for those of us who are participating via the Zoom meeting. So inshallah, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight Sister Rashida, and then inshallah, she can go ahead and start.
Alrighty. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, so when I saw the title of this chapter, The Fire This Time, I recalled a book, which I hadn't read until this week, actually, to be honest, with a similar title called The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. And the reference was confirmed when I got to the end of our chapter, right? And in Mr. Baldwin's book, he shares two essays. The first is a letter to his 14-year-old nephew, who was actually also his namesake. His name was James also, which Ms. Alexander includes a portion of at the end of our book. And the letter to his nephew is still pertinent today and could be given to any young Black male, actually, whether they live in the quote unquote ghetto or not, right? As the ghetto could be seen as a metaphor for his place in the world. She says, in part, quoting Mr. Baldwin, "This is the crime for which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I, nor time, nor history will ever forgive them. That they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives, and do not know it, and do not want to know it. It is their innocence which constitutes the crime. This innocent country set you down in a ghetto in which, in fact, it intended that you should perish. The limits of your ambition were, thus, expected to be set forever. You were born into a society which spelled out with brutal clarity and in as many ways as possible that you were a worthless human being. You were not expected to aspire to excellence. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity. You have, and many of us have, defeated this intention. And by a terrible law, a terrible paradox, those innocents who believed that your imprisonment made them safe are losing their grasp on reality. But these men are your brothers, your lost younger brothers. And if the word integration means anything, this is what it means, that we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it." And so he refers to integration here, of course, as this was written in the early 60s. But we could also look at integration today, for example, as our diversity and inclusion efforts, right? Especially the inclusion efforts part. But at the same time now, we are trying to move beyond that to equity, right? And a major point Ms. Alexander makes in this part of the chapter is essentially around tokenism. So in much the same way that she says mass incarceration as a race issue can be written off because there are some whites who get arrested, she argues because there are some Blacks who quote unquote make it, that we no longer have this societal racism, which we of course know is not the case. She calls this a bribe that we should give back. She says that affirmative action, which she admits to have benefited from, and other diversity initiatives actually mask the problem of the systemic nature of racism. And she said that these are basically like Band-Aids that don't get to the root of the problem and allows for the problem to persist while these initiatives are actually going on, and also allows for the problems to remain after the initiatives are over in some cases. And she calls it cosmetic racial diversity, or quote, reform efforts that make institutions look good on the surface without the needed structural changes. And that these efforts, quote, have actually helped to facilitate the emergence of mass incarceration and interfered with the development of a more compassionate race consciousness. And so a lack of compassionate race consciousness allows racism to persist. And she quotes a sociologist as saying, racism is so entrenched that without government intervention, there would be little, quote, progress to boast about. And she ties this to mass incarceration, saying that the new caste system depends on Black exceptionalism, on these Blacks that actually make it, right? And makes it appear as if any Black person can make it if they try hard enough. And therefore, as we've kind of been discussing before, that going to jail becomes this choice, right? And she says, quote, if the prison label imposed on them can be blamed on their culture, poor work ethic, or even their families, then society is absolved from the responsibility to do anything about their condition. And so another major point that she makes is she calls all of us or none of us, right? And I really enjoyed this chapter because she speaks to justice for all of us, not just Black, not just white, but all peoples of all backgrounds, including from a socioeconomic standpoint. And she refers to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his shift in focus to poverty, fair housing, and quality education before he was assassinated. The problem, he said, was that this new focus on a human rights movement, unlike the old civil rights movement, would actually cost something. She quotes him as saying, white America must recognize that justice for Black people cannot be achieved without radical changes in the structure of our society. The comfortable, the entrenched, the privileged cannot continue to tremble at the prospect of change in the status quo. And so to make this point about the need for structural change, she points out that even when Blacks are put in positions of authority, that they tend to follow the rules that have been previously set and still enforce unjust rules. And she compares Black police chiefs and Black officers to Black slave drivers and Black plantation owners. So that was a really an ouch moment there. She said that it was white men who wrote the rules and that no group in the United States can be said to have experienced more privilege and gone to greater lengths to protect it than, quote, the white man. She also points out, however, that poor and working class whites have felt the brunt of the civil rights initiatives like the integration of schools, neighborhoods, and local government jobs. And she says this has already made them easy targets of racist political agendas, as we've discussed in previous chapters, to not want to align themselves with other poor people who are Black because they want to keep the only privilege that they feel that they had, which was being white. So she says, quote, if meaningful progress is to be made, whites must give up their racial bribes too, and be willing to sacrifice their racial privilege. However, she also says, an aspect of human nature is the tendency to cling tightly to one's advantages and privileges and to rationalize the suffering and exclusion of others. And so I will end with this quote by the author. She says, if the movement that emerges to end mass incarceration does not meaningfully address the racial divisions and resentments that gave rise to mass incarceration, and if it fails to cultivate an ethic of genuine care, compassion, and concern for every human being of every class, race, and nationality within our nation's borders, including poor whites, who are often pitted against poor people of color, the collapse of mass incarceration will not mean the death of racial caste in America. inevitably a new system of racialized social control will emerge. And so if people are reluctant to give up their privilege, then why should they, right? What would move them to do so? And so I'd like to shift the conversation a bit to the second essay in The Fire Next Time, where Mr. Baldwin focuses on religion. Now, he lived in Harlem. He knew Malcolm X and was invited to the home of Elijah Muhammad when he visited Chicago. He grew up in the church partly, and his father was a preacher, but was abusive, and they had a strained relationship. He did not view God, it seemed, when he was, delivering his essay. He didn't view God as merciful because of his environment. And he said that he was not interested in Elijah Muhammad's offer to join them because he felt that they were just basically a mirror image of those who oppressed him. So now I'll have to do a little more research, to see how he viewed El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz when he returned from Mecca and had a change of heart because of the diversity he saw and experienced while making Hajj, including fellowship with his white brothers. El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, or Malcolm X, said that the cure for America's race problem is Islam. From the autobiography of Malcolm X, here is what he wrote in part about his Hajj experience. America needs to understand Islam because this is the one religion that erases from its society the race problem. Throughout my travels in the Muslim world, I have met, talked to, and even eaten with people who in America would have been considered white. But the white attitude was removed from their minds by the religion of Islam. I have never before seen sincere and true brotherhood practiced by all colors together, irrespective of their color. And so I thought I'd end, on a note of how to eradicate racism from society. And that's it for me. Back to you, Brother Kenneth. I can't, yeah.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Rashida. That was a very powerful endpoint from your end. And honestly, I don't really know if I can say anything that could go to the level of what you just said, which is basically how, Islam is the answer. And we have to look into the Quran and the example of our Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, to really kind of help guide us towards addressing these issues. And inshallah, next week we'll try and spend more time talking about what we can do to address some of the issues brought up by the book. So just a couple of points I really kind of want to highlight before we go ahead and end the live stream and open the floor for discussion in the Zoom meeting. And the quote that Sister Rashida ended with, not by Bowen, but by through the book, was actually what I was going to say, which is about the movement that emerges and mass incarceration does not meaningfully address the racial divisions and the sentiments that gave rise to mass incarceration. The quote that Sister Rashida made just a couple minutes ago, and there's really two main calls to action that I was able to identify from this chapter that I felt that the author was really trying to highlight to the reader. Number one was, and we mentioned this as well last week, and that is to acknowledge race. Do not fall into the stigma of being colorblind, right? Acknowledge that race exists, that there are disparities between races, and only then, once you acknowledge these differences, can you actually start addressing them. That's number one. And number two, she basically seems to call for instead of a civil rights movement, to a human rights movement. She basically calls for a complete structural change and societal change in this country. Almost like basically a focus onto the differences between classes. And it's kind of interesting because when I was reading her quotes about Dr. King and about these issues of human rights versus civil rights, I was reminded of a few years ago, if you guys remember, Occupy Wall Street. I think this happened. This was a movement that happened, I think, about maybe 5 or so years ago, if not longer. And that particular movement, even though unfortunately it didn't really, I think it only had traction for like a good maybe 6 months to a year before it ended up just kind of falling through the cracks. But that particular movement, Occupy Wall Street, was a call for, essentially, it was a call for addressing the difference in the socioeconomic differences and the socioeconomic divide between Americans, right? And somewhat similar to what the author is kind of trying to highlight in this chapter. But of course, Occupy Wall Street, I think, like I mentioned, only had traction for about 6 months to a year before eventually it's kind of fell through the cracks. And right now, a big focus, of course, is Black Lives Matter and what have you. But she makes a call for a change in focus and basically a complete structural change in society, which is, of course, as she mentioned, is something that's going to require a lot of attention, a lot of focus, and of course, a lot of sacrifice. And what I also found to be especially interesting is her critiques of the forgive me right now, my brain is a little kind of all over the place. The Sister Rashida, help me out here. The
critique of
the critique of
the civil rights movement.
Basically, the not the civil rights. Basically, about it's about the diversity. Like for some reason, like this, even though it's obvious where I can't think of it, but inclusion and diversity in places of education. What's the word again?
In education, you said?
You know what I'm talking about? Like inclusion, inclusion, like diversity, and I can't think of the word right now, which is so ridiculous. The word that we're all very, very familiar with that you mentioned before. But anyway, just to not waste anyone's time, her critique of this particular
affirmative action
practice. Yes, affirmative action. Yes, for some reason I could not think of that word for some reason, even though it's a word we're all very, very familiar with. Affirmative action. The critique of affirmative action, and how some of the critiques of it is, of course, is how those who are poor whites kind of see it as being unfair. And it's interesting because even today you see some of our politicians have these discussions and these criticisms of affirmative action. And I think even attacks on the civil rights movement of itself due to affirmative action. And so overall, I felt like the main two points she was trying to make was the importance of acknowledging race, which is very interesting because it's something we're kind of going over on our Tuesday halaqah with Brother Lonnie Abdul Alim Isaac over the book that he's going over. So those of you who are not joining us on Tuesday, I invite you to join us on Tuesday as well, which is acknowledging race. And Islam in of itself is not a colorblind religion. Of course, what I mean by that, as we spoke about in Tuesday, is Islam acknowledges that race exists. Like different cultures exist. And there's nothing wrong with acknowledging those races and cultures. The importance, of course, is acknowledging that that all these races and cultures are seen as equal in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the only thing that really can raise one's status in the eyes of Allah, of course, is your good deeds, your righteousness, how you conduct yourself, things of that nature. So number one, acknowledging race. Number two, calling for a total type of movement, a total type of social movement. And these are kind of the two main points that she leaves us with before the chapter ends. And so those are kind of my main thoughts that I wanted to highlight before we open the floor. So we'll go ahead and stop the live stream, and then we'll open the floor to discussion. Inshallah ta'ala, next week, for those of you who are tuning in via live stream, we are going to have one final session, which is going to be just more of an open discussion, talking about what are some tangible things we can do to acknowledge and address some of the problems that are brought up in this book. Basically, think of it as like a final thoughts plus call to action type of segment. So inshallah, we'll go ahead and do that next week. So with that, we'll go ahead and close the live stream and then open the floor for discussion. Allahumma subhanahu wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Jazakum khairan wa assalamu alaikum wa